that, can we get a huge, huge round of applause for Kat and Kristen?
Some handhelds.
Sorry, guys.
All right, cool. 1, 2. All right.
Thank you.
We're ready to go. Thank you, Greg, for that warm welcome. I'm super happy to be here. I work at Zendesk, but I'm also a proud member of the community that Greg's been building for us here over the past several months. Thank you all for coming. December is like a tough time to make time, and so we really appreciate all of you being here, and of course we really appreciate having Kat here with us as well. Y Combinator, I'm guessing I don't need to introduce to anyone at the room. Is everyone, show of hands, familiarity with Y Combinator, what these guys do? Yeah? Very good marketing and communications job. That's great. I do want to set a little bit of context before we really jump in. A little bit about myself. I've been at Zendesk for 3, almost 4 years now, up until about 3 weeks ago, working as the chief of staff to our CEO, and recently moved over full-time to run our startups program, which is super exciting for me. I'm very happy to have a fellow former chief of staff here with me tonight.
I was chief of staff to Alexis Ohanian, who was the founder of Reddit. So chief of staff love over here.
Yeah. But really for me, kind of jumping over and being a part of our startups program, like Greg said, we're 3,500 people today, but it's critical for our business that we continue to keep that spirit alive of working fast and hard and staying close to the fresh companies that are changing the way that all of us are living and doing business and things like that. When we think about the work that we do here at Zendesk, it's very much focused on the customer, right? We wake up every day thinking about how we make tools that will make it easier for companies to reach out to their customers, to grow them, to nurture them. And as we were talking with Kat, that differentiating factor of the customer can actually be really meaningful when applying to YC, in the program that you run folks through, and then ultimately in the growing of the business long term. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more tonight. Really pleased to have Kate here to talk through that with us.
Thank you for having me.
And do you want to say a few more words about your background?
Sure. So I've been at YC for about 6 years now, since 2013, and I've seen over 1,000 companies go through the program. And so when I started at YC in 2013, we were about 10 people full time, and I think the batches were about 75 companies. And now we are about 55, 60 full time, so not huge, but a good amount bigger, and we fund 200 companies every 6 months. So the batch is now about 200. And so it's been really interesting to see, YC in some ways is like a startup itself. We are always trying experiments and killing experiments and doing different interesting things. So it's a really dynamic place to be. Prior to YC, I worked for a couple years as the chief of staff to Alexis Ohanian. So this was after he left Reddit, but before he really went full time. And after he went Reddit and before he went back to Reddit. But we worked on basically his angel fund and nonprofit, and I basically helped him figure out how to support his early stage companies as they were launching and how to grow. He's one of the best community builders in the world, and so it was great to learn from him how to build great communities from scratch and how to help startups as they grow and how to help them do that as well. And prior to that, I worked at Wired Magazine. So I worked at Wired here on 3rd Street, not too far away, for 4 years. And that's how I actually met Alexis. In, I think, 2006, Reddit was acquired by Condé Nast, who was Reddit and Wired's parent company at the time. So we were in the same office. Reddit at the time was 5 people when I met them. So it was also really interesting to see Reddit grow. And I was at Wired at a really fun time. It was like 2008 to 2012, and a lot of young startups were coming out, Airbnb had just started, Kickstarter, Uber, recession, right? Exactly. So it was a really exciting time to be there and to watch a lot of young companies. I mean, Zendesk was 2007.
Yeah,
and they just
07
came to,
founded, yeah.
So it was, and before that I was in school. So it was a really interesting time to be both in publishing. It was like the media apocalypse was also 2008. But it was an interesting time for startups, and I think that's how I fell in love with them.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a different time than that for startups right now, right? Like more money than ever in the market, more ideas getting funded. You guys, I think you said you're averaging 15,000 applications a year.
15,000,
right
no,
now?
per batch. So
Per batch. So kind of with that, with the amount of money in the market and with the number of companies being created, one of the things that we had talked about, and I think folks here are interested to hear, is like, how do you stand out from the pack, right? There's a lot that people can do with product or with an idea, but when you reach the scale of 15,000 applications per batch, like, what really stands out amongst all the noise and the volume?
So you don't need any customers. I think when I looked last, it was 40% of the companies we fund were pre-launch. So they didn't have a launch product. And 60%, actually, wait, sorry, that's mixed. 40% had a launch product, 60% did not. So when people really obsess over the question, like, at what point should I apply to YC? And there's no correct answer. Like, there are some that we fund at idea stage, some we fund with millions of revenue. So there's no exact sweet spot. But what stands out is, first, of course, the team. We look for a great, well-balanced team that can both build the product that they're pitching us and, can also sell it. And they're articulate about the problem. They know what customer they're going to, customer they're building for. And so we like, teams that, have known each other for a little while, because, we see a lot of co-founder disputes kill some of the most promising early stage teams. So we love, like, if you've worked together at a previous company, gone to school together, have some context outside of just meeting each other 3 weeks ago and starting a company. Yeah. Even if you don't have a launched product, though, we do love to see that you've talked to potential customers or have a really clear sense of the problem you're solving and who you're solving it for. So we'll have people who will, pitch ideas, but they haven't validated it in any way. And so, honestly, we see, especially if you're pitching a product or idea that's fairly common or a lot of people have tried it, it's even more important for you as founders to understand the user, get insights from them, to understand how you're different from other players in the space or other people who've tried this idea before but have failed. I think that's, so for example, there are some canonical ideas that every batch I'll read 25 applications that are all trying to solve the same problem. And it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It clearly means there's a real problem.
There's a there.
Yeah, there's a there. And so it doesn't mean that we won't fund those very common ideas. But the problem is it's on the founder to figure out how to stand out more. And I think one way to do that is through talking to customers or potential customers and really understanding the problem from that perspective. I think I love it when, founders go really out of their way to figure out, is this a real problem? Like one of the companies we worked with, Lug, they're like an Uber for moving. Before they even built a product, they stood outside of IKEA and they would run up to people who had mattresses or like big items, and they'd say, "Hey, do you need help moving that?" And they would be like, "Yes, I do. I need help." And they were like, "Well, just click this button." And so they had the person like click a button and put their contact information, and like then the other founder would drive a van up from the parking lot. Like it was very manual. Yeah. They didn't actually build
very
anything.
On demand, which was great.
But they got out there and talked to those early customers and understood, like, is this a real need? Will people, even without knowing who you are or knowing the brand, will they click the button and pay you to do it? So even before you have a launched product, you can start that process of getting on the ground and talking to your early users.
Yeah, I remember we had the founders from Friend Shop, which was in a recent batch over, and they were talking about Friend Shop does group buying, and they're like, this is not a thing we do in the U.S. How do we learn if, American shoppers will group buy, because they were inspired by a Chinese company? And I remember them saying, they're like, the closest we could come to was Costco, because everyone in San Francisco has an apartment that's too small to hold a full bulk item that you would buy at Costco. And so like they went and stood outside and they were like, oh, so all that toilet paper, are you taking it all home? Are you sharing it with somebody? Did you plan in advance? And like, we're doing that kind of customer research in advance, which I think is really great.
And I love, so when we're looking at founders, we don't look at the, overall number of customers. So like people are like, how many customers before I apply? And it's not about the number, it's about how quickly you're growing and whether those customers are sticking. So we look at, if you have something launched, we look like how, what are you growing week over week? Is it, whether it's revenue or users, and then what's your retention look like? What's the churn look like? And so it's more important, in the early days to really understand, like, rather than having I think Paul Buchheit, who's one of our partners, he's always said it's better to have 100 people who love your product versus 1,000 people who are just kind of like meh about it. Because those people, those first 100 who love it will become your viral sales force. They'll start spreading the word for you. You'll really understand whether you have something that people want. You won't be, funneling users into a leaky bucket.
Yeah. Those 100 really passionate customers, though, sometimes, I think when we talk to companies, like there's a little bit of fear that it runs the risk of sending you down kind of a certain path too early, right? Like just because these are the people that are really passionate about the product today, is that really the market that you want to build for in the future? And so as you think kind of qualitatively about those early cohorts of customers, what's your advice in terms of making sense of like, I have I have these people that send me a lot of support tickets because they have like all of these things they think the product should do, and like I'm excited by that, but if it's at odds with the overall product roadmap or some of the other vision, how do you help companies think about working through that?
Well, I don't think your product has to be everything to everyone, especially early on. We try to tell our companies, startups typically do one thing really, really well. They become the best at this one thing. And then once they have, a handle on that one thing, then they can expand. But for example, if you think about Uber, right? If Uber had launched and suddenly all these parents were like, hey, we love your service, but, we would love to send our, elementary, school kids or infants to school via Uber. Like, and if Uber had been like, okay, let's try to service these customers, like Uber would look like a very different company today. It would be very different. And so I think the thing is, like, you have to have a strong sense as a founder of like, what's the hypothesis that you're going after? And like, if you start, people will try to hijack your service or your product to fit their need, but it's not necessarily the best idea to start pivoting your product or doing, exactly what, every single customer wants. Now, if it's a super high value customer, or if you start hearing the same piece of advice from a lot of different people, maybe that's a path to explore. But the one YC example was Justin TV. They started out at the very beginning with just Justin with a camera on his head, and then they pivoted to letting anyone broadcast their entire lives. And they started, and a small percentage of their very consistent but passionate users were people live streaming as they played video games. And so they started listening to those customers, and they started figuring out, like, well, maybe we can, if we start serving their needs more, like, does that mess up our, service or economics, or like, does that change what we do? And it turned out to be the right decision to follow those customers and to build what became Twitch. But so I think it really depends, and I think you have to have a conversation with your co-founders. You have to understand, like, is this a real potential path? Because yes, you're right. You hear a lot of early feedback, but it might not be from your target audience.
Yeah, and maybe sometimes too, right? If I think of the idea of standing outside of IKEA and talking to people, like that's not comfortable for all of us, right? Like, getting that direct user feedback, certainly going out and asking for it. It's easy for the emails to come in, right? But like going out and soliciting that is not always the hardest thing. How do you encourage folks where that is maybe a little bit of an unnatural, say I come in with a great product background, like how do you teach the product folks, like, to really kind of take the baby steps towards listening to a customer and starting to engage and build that narrative?
I think it's super important. Every founder should spend some amount of time doing customer support or talking to users. And of course, there might be one person on the team who spends way more of their time doing that. You might have someone who's building the product primarily and someone who's selling. And of course, typically the person selling is going to be the person interacting with the users early on. But an example, one of my partners, Kevin Hale, was a founder of Wufoo, which they made forms that because embed them on your site. They got bought by SurveyMonkey a long time ago. But basically, he tells a story about how when he was first starting, he was like, I'm the design co-founder, and I know exactly how the UI, UX of this site should be. And he was like, other people are stupid. Like, they just don't understand design. Like, this is how it should be done. And his co-founder's like, well, if you listen to the feedback from our users, and he was like, they just don't know, they're dumb. And so what they ended up doing at their company is that they ended up having everybody at the company take at least one, kind of session of customer support per week. So all the founders, everyone working at the company did customer support. And after he was forced to sit there and do customer support every week and actually read the tickets and respond to customers, he was like, oh, I may not be the genius that I thought I was. and I really do need to listen to the feedback. Like, people are having trouble using this. Yeah. And so I do think, especially in the early stages, it's important for every founder, even if it's not the core piece of their job, to do some of it so they understand what the real problems and pain points are.
Yeah. How many folks, just show of hands, how many folks in the audience have customers in their startups right now? Yeah. Okay. How many of you guys answer tickets and are actively talking with customers? It's good. Yeah, that's good.
It's cheaper that way in the beginning. I mean, you have to.
Yeah, for sure. And so, I think kind of again, like this idea that talking with your customers can be a thing that starts really showing some differentiation in the way that you're thinking about a model or the level of robustness around it. Like, what are some of the tells then? Because you have 25 applications that are kind of around the same thing, and everybody's taking your advice and they're talking to the customers. Like, what are some of the things that come out of those conversations that help you say, like, I think this team really gets it more deeply, or has created some sort of advantage for themselves as a function of kind of going deep?
Yeah, so I think that it becomes clear when people have spent time either with the problem, like either as a they're building something that solves a personal pain point. And so that's an easy mode way to start, because you understand the pain and you're fixing your own problem and you're the first user, you're the first customer. But if you're not doing that, it's especially important to get out there and talk to, potential users. And I think what happens is, when we're talking to some companies or reading the application, it's not clear, the idea sounds good, but it's not clear who exactly they're building it for. So when we ask, sometimes we'll ask, if we could hand you, we have 4,000 founders, like over 2,000 companies we've funded. We could probably hand you 5 perfect customers. Who are those 5 perfect customers? And if you don't have an answer to that, like that's an issue. And you'd be surprised by how many people don't have an answer to what are the 5, if we could just hand you the best possible customers for you. And so understanding who are those 5 perfect customers, what exactly do they do, like what industry are they in, like what is the role that you're selling to, like who is the person in the company that you'd be selling to. If you don't know those things even fairly early, it's hard to help. Even if you're just asking us for help generally, like not even as a YC company, if you're like, please introduce me to customers, if it's very vague, it's impossible to ask people for help. Like, you have to be as specific as possible. So, I've talked to a lot of companies who are like, oh, we're building this, say it's like it's like a sales management tool or a vendor management tool, but we're building it for banks, but we're also building it for, it could be for large enterprise healthcare companies. And you're like, those sound like very different products. And early on, as I mentioned, as a startup, you can only really serve, one type of customer at the beginning fairly well. So I think it becomes obvious when things aren't very concrete, when you get pretty vague answers.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And kind of, I think it's interesting. We saw it in our business too, like, being really clear about that first customer. We love that today we have customers that hack on our product in all sorts of different ways to fit all of the needs that they have, and like, as long as they know the pain that they might incur in the future, like for going down that path, like we're generally okay with it. But yeah, that push early to like get really specific, or to say like, you're going to create something that's only serving, we create a fairly general product in the end, right? But some of that early, attention about, do we really focus, it'll constrain the market, but it'll make it easier to know what we're going after. Like that's a perpetual sort of challenge that I think that we deal with as well. But that, that resisting that sort of push to kind of, well, build me this very precise thing, or, I'm your largest customer now and I want this feature built, put it on the top of your list. I don't care. And so we've talked to companies and founders that have, found creative ways to kind of manage that sort of large customer, wish list alongside of your own product roadmap. So we talked about kind of the application. When companies then get accepted to YC, how do you actually work with them kind of through that period of time, and what's the trajectory you really want to see people going on in the very intensive period that they're in the batch?
Sure. So we at YC, pretty much from the very first dinner, from the time that all the founders arrive, we tell them, you should really only be using your time at YC for two things. That's, building the product and talking to users. So that's, building and, selling essentially, and getting feedback from users and iterating based on their feedback. And everything else, other than sleeping and eating, spending some time with your family, like other than that, is a total waste of time. So, and you can we tell people, you can blame YC. You can say like, I'm sorry, my friend, I can't help you move this weekend because of YC. And so you have 3 months, and we say this is the one point in your life, in your company's life perhaps, where you can have complete focus. And so a lot of our founders will go through the program, and we have weekly dinners, but we also have office hours, either individually with partners or group office hours with every 2 weeks. But typically after a startup graduates from YC, they're like, that was the most productive time of our company's life. How do we recreate that? And it's hard. So we really give people a framework for that focus. And so we work with them really closely for those 3 months, and they're for the most part just coding and talking to users, and asking us for help or advice, or asking the YC alumni community for help or advice. But otherwise, they spend most of the time on their own, and then we do demo day, which is at the end of the 3 months. We help figure out how to tell your story most compellingly, we do something called vertebrae office hours, where we help you figure out what are the 3 key points that are going to make investors super excited about what you're building. And then, we help them with a demo day presentation, and they present in front of about 1,500 investors in person and a couple thousand online. Hopefully companies raise between, 18 months to 2 years, worth of runway for funding, but so that they have some time to gear up for a Series A. So that's, the general, our hope for companies is that they raise what they need to raise to keep going for 18 months to 2 years. And then once they're ready for a Series A, we have a Series A program that helps them gear up for that. And then once they're even bigger, we have a growth program which rebatches the companies and helps the sort of B+ companies grow. And so it's kind of, we are cradle to IPO, I think we've said. We try to help companies from the very beginning all the way till they're all out there.
Awesome. I'm going to turn it over to you guys for questions here in a minute. Maybe though, I want to ask one more, Kat. You're talking about the 3 vertebrae, and we were talking earlier as well about kind of what are the really compelling metrics, or when you talk about a customer, then you've gone through this period, you've got all of this qualitative feedback, you're tracking some quantitative data as well. What are some of the things that you look for that, you see a lot of demand in the market when startups start pitching at demo day or beyond, when it comes to talking about their customer in particular?
Yeah, so we've actually published a couple guides. So if you're ever looking to pitch investors, I would look at, there's a guide to fundraising, and in terms of templates, there's also we have a template for demo day presentations that will give you sort of a sense of what the highlights are. But one will be, how quickly are you growing? So is it, we usually try to help you figure out at the very beginning of YC, we help you figure out what metric do you want to see grow, 10% week over week. And for most companies, unless you're hard tech or, some hardware or biotech, for most companies, it's going to be users or revenue. And so, the goal will be to help you grow 10% week over week there. And then, so at the end of demo day, you'll have a pretty significant growth trajectory. So most companies that have a launched product will show how quickly they've grown. It'll show how many, they'll show, what is the, this is where we're starting today, but here's the big vision. We look, investors like to see team background. So what did the team, where do they come from? Do they have expertise in this space? What's the, why is this team going to be the team that wins in X space? And yeah, people love to hear stories about, how quickly this team can move. So, we've been working on this 6 months and we've launched this product and we have X users and this is how quickly we're growing. And this is where we see the world going. And this is what the world will look like when 1 million people are using a product. Because at the early stage, even post YC, people are still just mostly betting on the founder and the idea that they can build something huge. So there's an aspirational element to it as well.